The other thing that is critical in these types of communities and codes is creating a sense of enclosure. We often talk about this as the idea of the outdoor room. The idea that when you walk outside in a quality pedestrian environment, you should feel like you're in a space that kind of has an outdoor room feel to it. You have walls, which could be buildings, it could be trees. The ceiling, is the sky, but it's you don't feel so open to it that you feel unprotected. Very important to understand that there's a basic level of protection that you have to feel when you're walking outside to actually make it comfortable to walk around it. When most of us are in spaces that are so wide open that the wind really gets to you, or the temperature or whatever, it tends to make us really uncomfortable and not want to walk. And so, not everything has to look like this street in Boston or be that dimension for it to be successful. It could be like those other streets that I showed before. But there is a range where human beings feel comfortable. This is in Westport. And this is Pennsylvania Ave in Westport, which is has very good dimensions and a very comfortable outdoor room space. But it could also be an environment like this. And this is, again, down in Brookside, but I think one of the things that you notice about this street is it's really the trees and the consistency of the trees in the landscape that creates that boundary and that feeling of comfort. So the buildings do it here as well, but the trees do it more. And so a lot of codes then are written to support this notion and look back at these kind of rules, which frankly designers have studied for hundreds of years, which is what is a space that feels comfortable to walk around in? What are the proportions of a space that people actually like to walk around in? And we generally find that for streets, it's somewhere in the ballpark of 1 to 1. That if a street space between the buildings is 50 feet wide, then about 50 feet in height, somewhere in that ballpark, give or take. It doesn't have to be completely rigid, but somewhere in that ballpark is about what feels comfortable as you're walking down the street. For a square, a space that you might casually relax in, it can broaden out more to sort of a 1 to 3. And then the other key thing, like I mentioned before, is that enclosure could actually be created by buildings or by tree canopy. So it doesn't have to be one or the other. That's why a lot of residential streets, like those ones that I showed, where the space between buildings may be 100 feet, but the street trees and that continuous network of street trees makes it feel comfortable. That's why it works there. So one thing to consider then, and a lot of codes will address that, is how do you create that? And just because you have building walls on both sides, it doesn't always mean it's good. This is an example where you have sort of one scale of building across on this side of the street and a completely different scale. That's a very monolithic scale on this side of the street. And we may walk around this and say this isn't really too bad compared to a lot of streets that we're used to. But the reality is this is a far inferior street space than many others, or certainly as to what it could be, because you have one very large monolithic structure that's not only taller but also quite a bit wider than all of the other structures in that street, and it creates a whole different presence as you walk down the street. And you'll generally find here is people will be walking on this side of the street. So, some second order goals, things that you'd like to have, and again, this is going to depend on your community and what they're ready for, what they're used to. Dealing with architectural design. How much do you want to get into issues of, what a porch should look like, what the window proportions should be, what roof proportions should you have, how do you deal with building materials. There are a lot of communities that want to regulate these things. So again, know yourself, know what you're prepared to be able to review as well. If you have these rules, if you want to do these rules, do you have a staff who actually knows how to deal with them and knows how to review roof pitches and understands building materials? If you don't, then you might consider whether that's the right route to go. Another element is private open space. So we talk a lot about the sort of public open space on the front side of buildings, but there's also, especially in a more dense walkable environment, the notion of private open space becomes increasingly important, because you're setting up a situation where you're expecting sort of a more public lifestyle, but you still want to have privacy and the ability to have some sort of at least semi-private open space on properties. And so, this is, we get into places where some communities actually still want to regulate this as well in order to require that there are certain private open space elements regardless of what the project is. So whether that's a lawn or a courtyard, a porch, something like that. This is an example from a community that we worked in where we did very narrow single-family homes on very narrow lots. These are 35-foot wide lots. And so the street's out here, the alley's in the back, and this particular developer set up a condition where they created use easements all the way down the block so that all of the yard space between the houses essentially became used by one house. So even though it was a very narrow lot condition, they had these very private side yards. And then the houses were designed in a manner so that your house opens up to your side yard. Your neighbor's house has windows that are up high, so they don't look into your side yard. They don't actually see down directly into it. That condition is set up all the way down the block. That was an example of how even in a very narrow lot condition, which it seems counterintuitive to us that you could live on a 3,000 square foot single family lot and have a really nice patio or lawn space. But in this condition, you can do it. But that was a situation created by the developer. It's something that can be regulated and looked at if you want to do so. In a more dense environment and a more multi-family condo environment, the provision of courtyards, for example. And there are a lot, as we talk about building types, the courtyard building type is a fairly common example as you get into a little bit more dense communities as well. So this is a private open or sort of a semi-private open space that's behind the street wall of these particular buildings. Signage is another issue as well that we often wrestle with in these codes because most of you probably have a sign ordinance of some kind, and then there's always a question of how do you want to deal with a sign ordinance related to a specific area. It's something we talked about in Blue Springs. I'm sure you guys dealt with it too in Mission. But there's always a question of do you want to write a specific set of signage guidelines for this particular code or default to sort of a citywide signage standard that you've already developed. I will say for these areas, it's a little more signage, is a little more sensitive issue. In terms of, again, you have an environment that you're creating where people are going to see and notice things a lot more because they're on top of it. And so signage is always a little bit more of an issue that way than when you're driving by at 40 miles an hour. You have a different experience to it. Okay, so that's sort of the prelude. This is then the piece where I start talking about the elements of these codes and how they work. So any form-based code essentially has these 5 elements to it in some fashion and in some level of detail. The thing that ties it all together at the top is what we call a regulating plan, and that's a plan that is a specific plan that looks like a zoning map that is for that area that you've master planned. So it's a very specific plan that will have a lot of information on it related to that neighborhood. There are urban standards, which really, these are the heart of the building form standards that deal with where things sit on a property, height, use, etc. Architectural standards are things that deal with architectural design, specific architectural design issues. Again, like in the Blue Springs example, we had very minimal in this area, but we did have building material standards, which I would classify as architecture standards. So we didn't prescribe this specific architectural design issues, but we did talk about building materials. Landscape standards, again, that could be anything from as minimal as just street trees to full streetscape standards and park standards and standards for how you would deal with the frontage on your property and landscape area. Again, depends on how far you want to go. And then a critical one, which I'll talk about later, is the idea of thoroughfare or street standards. And this is a different one. This is something that's very hard for your engineering and public works staff to deal with. But if you want to have a successful walkable area, you have to have it. It's absolutely critical. You've got to develop street standards that work for this area, because I guarantee most of you have street standards that do not work for walkable communities. So it's absolutely critical that you put in place the standards that really prescribe how it's going to work for this neighborhood. And that's, so that, we'll talk about that more as I get to it at the end, but that is a very hard thing for most public works and engineering people to deal with.